Hello, my name is Richard Spilman, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Delta Cultural Center, and this is Joseph Alley. He is the Curator at the Helena Museum here in Helena, Arkansas. And we thought we'd bring a story that is related to the past of the Arkansas Delta. When we think of the Delta, what do we think of? We think of rivers. And so in the past, steamboats were a major part of life for the people who lived down here. But steamboats weren't just important for carrying goods and for transporting passengers and for things like that. Sometimes it was a form of entertainment. And something that was very commonly found in the late 19th century were steamboat races. And we're going to talk about one in particular between two, the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez. And it was a steamboat race that went from the very bottom part of the Mississippi River, came through up the Arkansas Delta, and went all the way up to St. Louis. And so, very large race between these two, and we're going to talk a little bit about the two steamboats themselves, their captains, and about what happened. And so, I'm going to let Joseph, he's going to talk a little bit about the Natchez here, and then I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Robert E. Lee. So, Joseph, what can you tell me a little bit about the Natchez?
So, the Natchez. Steamboat, of course. So, before we talk about it, I do think it is worth to bring up the captains, because the thing is, these weren't just boats. These were, these boats had personalities of their own, ways that they operated, that they ran, and those personalities, of course, can be directly attributed to the men that owned and operated them. Of course, for the Natchez, we have Captain Thomas Paul Leathers. Captain Leathers, he was eccentric to say the least. I've heard other stories refer to him as Cratchity. His nickname was Old Push. He is a Kentucky native. He got his riverboat industry start on the Yazoo River in 1836. And he was very, very successful working as a riverboat captain, running various iterations of the Natchez up and down the Mississippi River. He, in fact, owned and operated 7 different boats, all named the Natchez. Of course, later we'll be talking about the 7th iteration. Let's see. So, let's see here now. He was... you can't really tell it from this photograph, but he was known to have a very flamboyant appearance. He was a very shrewd businessman. He had very weird operating parameters. One of the things that he was known for was throwing bacon fat onto the steam engine pistons under the belief that it would make his boats run faster. And of course, speed was the name of the game. Of course, he also would willingly give all of his workers copious amounts of whiskey, thinking that that would make them work quicker. He was known to just go in his boat straight head on, heading off other boats on the river, making them slow down so he can look like he's being just a little bit faster. My favorite thing is his Natchez's whistle. All the iterations of the Natchez had the same whistle that sounded like a gigantic bumblebee, and Leathers loved to just sound this thing off as much as possible. He said it was he was waking up people on the shore to let them know the Natchez was coming past. So he lived a long, full life up until the age of 80, up until he retired to one of his homes in St. Louis in New Orleans on St. Charles Street. He met his untimely end. He was run over by a bicycle, and that is what ended up doing him in. So, of course, I understand your captain was just as flamboyant.
Yes, Captain John Cannon was his name, and this is him right here. I'm just going to put it down for y'all to take a look at. And John Cannon, he usually had a little bit of a different personality to him compared to Leathers. Sorry, but Cannon, basically, he was born in Kentucky. And he loved the river all his life, and even from a very early age, he grew up on the river. And when visiting his brother, who was a marshal in New Orleans, his brother tried to get him to do other things. He said, well, why don't you go to be educated? So canon, that's what he did, exactly what he did. He went, he got himself educated, but he really just couldn't stay away from the river, and so ended up being a captain. Back in 1848, he piloted a boat that was known as the Louisiana. It wasn't that much long afterwards when it exploded and ended up not being able to use that boat. But he ended up piloting 2 other boats since then. He piloted one called the Vicksburg and the General Quitman. Well, with the Vicksburg, the thing about that particular boat is that it was used during the Civil War as a gunboat. It was pretty much taken from him. It was used by by troops during that time. The other boat that he had, which was the General Quitman, he actually, when he moored that, he saw, well, I don't want the same thing to happen to my other boat that's going to happen to the Vicksburg. So he took the General Quitman and he docked it, and he kept it there until after the Civil War when he started using it again. So, during his time, he was, known for being, having a very fast and very luxurious boats, and those are pretty much what he piloted throughout his time. After the, later in life, he also died of, very interesting circumstances, where he actually died shortly after the race we're going to talk about 7 years after, where he died of tuberculosis. And kind of got it about 6 years prior to his death, and then about 6 years later, he ended up, dying of his illness, having a leg injury as well, and so during the last year of his life also was damaged from his leg, and so he actually was handicapped as well as having tuberculosis. So his last stages, even though he was known for being such a fit person and such being a very active person during the last few years of his life, he really just went downhill very, very quickly. So very interesting person, and like the other captain, very flamboyant and very interesting personality. So I think that we're going to go ahead and start off talking about.
Well, I was going to say, just comparing the two, I did find that, like your guy, it's a painting versus a photograph. So obviously this is going to look better than what he actually looked like. You pay for a painting, you pay for a good painting. But yeah, he's jovial. That's the thing that got me. And it was even comparing them both, because they're both steamboat captains, both river guys, but he is focused on business. He, at the end of the day, it's only a successful day for him if he's got more money than when he started with that morning. But for him, it just seems like he cared more just about being on the river.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was happiest in the pilot house.
Yeah, and that's the way it was. Even from a very young age, he really did not want to get educated. His brother said, I want you to get educated. And he said, well, I'll do it. But he did it for his brother. He wanted to get back on that river as soon as possible. That's the way he spent his whole life. It was his love. And so, you very much so, two very different personalities. So.
I see it also would be, of course, talking about the time period, we can't just, glance over the Civil War. It is, I will say, for it was different approaches during the war. So with Leathers, he was an ardent defender of the Confederacy up until his dying day. It's actually recorded that the Natchez was flying the Confederate stars and bars for years after the Civil War was over. Conversely, with Cannon, money's, and conversely, I say money, highest bidder. He worked for both the U.S. Navy and the Confederate Navy, running equipment and other such things for them. So, different approaches definitely in how they operated during the Civil War.
And so, basically, their different personalities led to what we're going to talk about.
Yes.
So
the boats themselves, and I will just go ahead and say, so I'm a huge train guy, so I love steam engines, but the steamboats are a bit of a different beast than what you have with a steam engine. So of course, the Natchez here, this was Leather's boat. This was the 7th iteration. Now I will say, the first Natchez was low pressure steamboat built in 1823, ran at the lower part of the Mississippi. It wasn't until we get to the 2nd iteration. And I only bring this up to state that by the time we get to the 7th iteration, of the Natchez. It's worth noting that this boat weighed 7 times more than the second iteration of the Natchez. These things were getting constantly just giant, huger, and just ostentatious is a word that I would use, and how fancy they could get. It was always about getting bigger and better and faster. So, of course, with the Natchez, let's see here now. Let's see here now. 301 feet long, 8 boilers, and a capacity of 5,500 cotton bales. Like I said before, 1,547 tons of weight sitting in the water. And like I said, that is 7 times heavier than the first boat named Natchez that Captain Leathers owned. It is worth noting that in this boat's 9.5 years of service, she made 401 trips up and down the Mississippi River. There was not a single fatality in this boat's operating history. This is a feat that is almost completely unheard of. We're talking about in a time period in which you get too deep of a cut on your leg, it's a death sentence. There are people constantly getting injured and mangled and killed on these types of ventures. Anything from boiler rupture to an obstinate mule that's also on board and just refuses to get off the boat can spell your end. But with the Natchez, for the 401 trips that it made up and down the mighty Mississippi, there was not a single life lost, and that's definitely something worth noting. It's also, I should say, something to note on here, just how you do your advertising, because, and it's something that Richard will point out a little later, each one of these boats, you might look at them from a distance and think, oh, it's just the same white blob running up and down the river, but each captain had their own personality, each boat had their own personality. The Natchez had its own whistle, so when the Natchez was coming up the river, you knew the Natchez was coming up the river.
All right. Okay. All right, and the Robert E. Lee was a very different type of boat. That doesn't mean that it wasn't any less important. And in a way, when you're talking about the Natchez, you're saying, you know when it comes up the river. Well, in a way, you kind of know that about the Robert E. Lee as well. The nickname for it was the Monarch of the Mississippi. Just to give you an idea of just how large and how big this was. But in reality, this boat here was a luxurious steamliner. People wanted to come on here for fun. This was a place where the rich would hang out. This one here was actually built back in New Albany, Indiana, back in 1866. And there were 2 other Robert E. Lees that were built which had no connection to Cannon or to this Rex. This one was 280 feet, 5 feet long and 46 feet wide, with a pilot house at 30 feet above the main dock. This one here, what was important about it was its power. It actually had 8 boilers to power 2 paddle wheels. There's a lot of power behind this boat, which is what led to the race. But inside the steamboat itself, that was where you saw a very fancy steamboat. To give you an idea, it actually had 61 staterooms, 24 extra rooms, a Texas passenger house, a nursery for servants, and a cabin adjoining the nursery, which are staterooms for 50 passengers. So this boat here could hold several hundred people at a time. The inside actually had a main cabin carpet made out of Winston velvet that was 220 feet long just for that carpet. So this is a huge boat that we're talking about here.
Genuine floating palace.
Absolutely, absolutely. Furniture is made of solid rosewood and was artistically elaborately carved. Cushions were made of heavy crimson satin. Dining room had 20 extension dining tables. Each could seat 12 guests for a total of 240 guests. And it had rich furniture, dazzling chandeliers, arched and fretted ceilings etched with gold, stained glass skylights, immense mirrors, velvet carpet, and imitation Egyptian marble stills, just to give you an idea of just some of the things that were in here. So you're traveling in style if you're going on the Robert E. Lee. However, the highlight of this boat was the steamers. It actually had twin high-pressure steam engines with 120 pounds of working steam pressure and could run as fast as 15 miles per hour. So to give you an idea of just how powerful this was and just how luxurious it was, it actually had a little bit of both. So what actually happened to these two boats, and what happened to these captains that made them decide we're going to go ahead and race each other? Well, it actually the race itself started in 1870. And what actually started?
So it's a rivalry, is what it is, because you had Leathers and Thomas. They were business rivals. Now they were close, they were friends. They did nearly go in business with each other at one point. But it's all about proving how good you are. And both of these guys were constantly vying for new records, new ways to promote themselves, new ways to say that they were the best on the river. It's also worth noting at this period in history that railroads were starting to become a major factor. Now, of course, in Arkansas, we hardly had anything. We had the the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad that didn't even run to Memphis and Little Rock. But more importantly, there wasn't a rail link between New Orleans and Chicago. It was the Mississippi River that was the preeminent mode of transportation. But railroads were nipping at riverboats' heels. So this was not just a rivalry between two businessmen, but this was also a means of showing that riverboats were still a major contender for transport up and down the central part of America. Now, the race itself wasn't so much a planned thing as it was a little bit spur of the moment. So it was in June of 1870. You had an instance where Cannon was sitting down in New Orleans, and basically he just had this inkling. He's like, I want to outdo the Natchez. So the Natchez, of course, is going to be steaming down in about a day or so. So he sends word to Leathers, and as the story goes, the race is on. And this is where we really need to point out the differences in operations between these two men, because, spoiler alert at the very end, the lead does win. But there's a lot to take into account to get the lead to its win. And the very first thing is business practices. Yes, we're talking about a race between two massive steamboats, and business is the primary motivator for all of this. Especially, money talks. So, Leathers, during his stops, everything's going as normal. He is stopping, unloading passengers, unloading freight, taking on passengers and freight all up and down the river while this race is going on. Cannon, he's making a straight shot up to St. Louis. Nothing stopping him. And it's actually, he doesn't even bother to properly reload in New Orleans. Fuel reload, what he does is he engages with a riverboat called Paragode. And Paragode, before the race even starts, heads up to Baton Rouge, just north of it, and waits there. And as the Robert E. Lee is sailing on past, they tie up together, and the Paragode dumps its load of coal into the lead so that the lead doesn't have to stop for refueling. Leathers, he doesn't have that kind of a luxury, and he doesn't even plan for it. For him, this is a regular stop, this is a regular run up the Mississippi River. The main difference is that he's genuinely rushing to try and make this go as quickly as possible. Now, they do both briefly stop up in Natchez, and as a matter of fact, Cannon, he actually breaks the record. Let's see now, what is that? Let's see now, 16 hours, 36 minutes and 47 seconds from New Orleans to Natchez. And the mayor goes out on a little boat and meets the Robert E. Lee as it's going past and hands him a little trophy as a way of saying congratulations. Of course, they're rounding up the bend, and so let's see here now. It is June 30th, 5 p.m. when the race starts, and then we get to Helena, Arkansas. Arkansas, on July 2nd, and that's where I'm going to hand it off.
Yeah,
to
absolutely. So on July 2nd, the Lee passed by Helena with the Natchez colony about 54 minutes later. And so, what's great about history is that history is recorded. And this is from a gentleman who was there, who actually experienced this there in Helena, Arkansas. His name is James Millender Hanks. And he says, this is from his book, he says, "This afternoon I have done little more than watch the steamboat race. The Lee came in sight 11 minutes past 3 p.m. and the Natchez 57 half minutes later. They made the run through hers in the same time, 49 and a half minutes. Both have come up from NO in less than, I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to there.
New Orleans.
New Orleans, okay, thank you. In less than 2 days, which is very fast running. We had rain today, found my missing gray turkey this afternoon. Let Henry have it for about $10. So there's a few other things talking about too. But he's witnessing this event that he had never witnessed before, this amazing race with the Lee and Natchez. So now, right at this point, the Natchez is right behind the Lee. And so they're kind of very close behind.
Literally nipping at the heels.
Absolutely. So basically they keep going by, and then at about 10 o'clock that night, they started going towards Memphis. Well, the people of Memphis were cheering for the Lee. And so they saw what they thought was the Lee out there in the Mississippi River. So they started firing cannons and firing fireworks and all these other things coming up. And you know what? It wasn't. It was a completely different boat called the Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson went in and thought, what do we do to deserve all this? But Jack Thompson kept going, and eventually the Lee came up with no fireworks to meet them. I'm sorry. And then, so that's what happened there. Just around midnight, the Natchez was unloading its final passengers before they're in Memphis, or leaving for St. Louis, about an hour behind the Lee. Knowing this, Cannon knew that he was trying to catch up with them. So, down in Cairo, Illinois, ordinarily, they would make a kind of a quick stop up the Ohio a little bit, and then come back, and then go up to St. Louis. However, that's not what Cannon decided to do. He decided that if it's okay with the other passengers, he was going to drop them off at Cairo, and then he was going to keep going on. Now, he wasn't very familiar with that section of the Mississippi River. He hadn't gone very far in the Cairo section. So he got a couple more pilots that knew a little bit more about it, put them on there, and right behind him, it wasn't far at all, the Natchez was there. His snag bar, and then it took him a little while to get off that snag bar, but eventually they were able to get off. But this helped the Natchez catch up. By about 16 minutes, they caught up. So onwards they went, kept going, and this is where a spot where Leathers kind of messed up a little bit, because around Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the temperature suddenly took a sudden change. Fog began to gather. The Natchez was catching up to the Lee, but this is where Leathers kind of made a little bit of a mistake here, because what Cannon decided to do is that he decided he was going to slow way down, but he was going to plunge on towards St. Louis. He wasn't stopping for anything. But Leathers thought, well, you know what, maybe Cannon's probably going to stop. I can't see, so he can't see. So I'm going to stop here, wait for the fog to clear out, stop there in a place called Grand Tower, Missouri, and then we're going to wait out the storm. But when the fog cleared out and everything was good, then he got word that Cannon and his boat, the Robert E. Lee, were way ahead of him, and he knew from then on out that he had been beaten. So finally, at 11:35 a.m. on July 4th, 18 hours and 14 minutes past the beginning of the race, Cannon, along with Robert E. Lee, hit the area of St. Louis. The Natchez would pull into there about 4 days and 47 minutes,
4
hours.
Yes.
And 47 minutes. I meant to say 4 hours. But his record was 3 hours and 44 minutes. His record was 4 hours and 47 minutes, not 4 days, so that's very different. So it was about an hour behind. So, but it was because of that one error in judgment that's what happened, and that would help Cannon to win. So what actually happened to these guys, or whatever happened to the boats after the steamboat race? Well, with the Robert E. Lee, what happened with this boat is that it went to retirement in 1876. All the furnishings that were in there were basically transferred to lodging places, and there's still remnants of various places today. In a church that is there in a First Presbyterian Church in Fort Gibson, Mississippi, and I don't know if y'all can see that very well, the chandeliers from that boat still hangs in that church today. And there are some very fancy, you can kind of see a little bit about how fancy they were. They had the deer heads on it, very luxurious chandeliers, still being used in different places.
Like I said, borderline ostentatious.
Absolutely.
They were not afraid to show off how wealthy and fancy they were.
A carved wooden Indian, once part of the Natchez furnishings, is preserved on a stake near Natchez, and parts of the Lee's boilers are still on a Louisiana sugar plantation. And so different things that were used from different boats are found throughout parts of Mississippi in various museums. Some parts are found at the Vicksburg Old Courthouse Museum. There are different parts of these steamboats. So where we go, these steamboats, probably not the whole thing, but you can see parts of it scattered throughout different places and various businesses and museums throughout parts of Mississippi.
And I will, one thing, so one other thing to note is the record that was set by the Robert E. Lee, because at the end of the day, like I said, they're wanting to prove something. And this was, what was the Lee's final record again?
I think it was 3 hours. Let's see. It was 3 hours. And
well, what was the total record?
From right here. It was 3 hours and 18 minutes, or 3 days, 18 hours, and 14 minutes.
Okay, so the Robert, yes. So the thing is, this record of going from New Orleans to St. Louis, 3 days, 18 hours, and 14 minutes, was set on July 4th, 1870. And this was a record that was not beaten until 1929. Oh goodness, my apologies. He had a hobby of running a little speedboats up and down the Mississippi River. It was in 1929 that essentially chased the Robert E. Lee. It made a bunch of local papers. And to the best of his ability, he not only followed the Lee, but he actually beat that record by about a half an hour. And, but even then, it's worth noting that was a private speedboat. To this day, 2 centuries later, there has not been a single commercial riverboat to beat the Robert E. Lee's time from New Orleans to St. Louis. It is a record that still stands after all these years, which is a true testament to how much power and tenacity these monstrosities were able to make use of them when they were plying their trades up and down the Mississippi River.
Yeah, two very different boats, and it's kind of the end of an era, pretty much. You know, kind of the end of what we're starting to see with steamboat races. We stopped seeing a lot of that after 1870. We started seeing more of the railroads, like we were talking about earlier, and we started seeing major change. So a lot of the stuff that we started seeing, you know, a lot of steamboat operators thought, well, it's not very efficient to do this anymore. At one time, it was, you know, part of the part of fun that could do that, and have a little bit more ability to do that. After about 1870, we started seeing a lot of the decline in steamboat races and things of that nature for the uses of it. So, but anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing this story with us. And a lot of great things, a lot of great stories, both at the Helena Museum as well as at the Delta Cultural Center. Come, feel free to check us out, see some of our exhibits, and we'll be more than happy to show you our museums.
You guys are back to being open full-time now, correct?
We are still open from 10 to 4. We are going to be opening full-time here on May 17th.
May 17th. The Helena Museum is currently open to the public on Saturdays from 10 to 4. Groups can make appointments on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays if you call ahead. I think I speak for both of us when I say we're very eager to get visitors down here in Helena. And please, if you find yourself coming through, please do not hesitate to call and ask, because we are more than eager to share our stories at the Arkansas Delta.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for sharing these stories with us.
Mm-hmm.